Welcome to Grizzly Ethics, where we explore the moral questions behind managing one of North America's most iconic and controversial animals, the grizzly bear. I'm Jacob.
And I'm Tucker. Thanks for joining us today as we dive into the complex world of wildlife ethics, focusing specifically on the case of grizzly bears. Whether you're an animal lover, a hunter, or a policymaker, or just someone curious about the wild, this episode is for you.
So, why talk about grizzly bears? Well, they become a focal point in debates about conservation, hunting, and human wildlife conflict. Grizzly bears are currently protected under the Endangered Species Act in the lower 48. But there have been ongoing legal actions and political efforts to remove those protections in areas like the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I live only 45 minutes away from Yellowstone, and I have seen how grizzly bears affect these ecosystems personally. For an example, just last year, a family friend's ranch had 13 calves killed by grizzly bears, and they weren't allowed to do anything about it, even when they caught those bears on their own security cameras. They did what they were told to do, they reported it to Fish and Game. And the next day, federal agents came to their ranch and killed three different grizzly bears. So I ask, why can't people defend their livelihood anymore?
Exactly, and when that happens, the big question kind of becomes should states be allowed to manage grizzly populations through practices like trophy hunting, and what obligations do we have to these animals and to those ecosystems they're a part of?
These questions are deeply ethical. They go beyond just biology or ecology. They ask us to think about how we value life, wilderness, and the role of humans in managing or interfering with nature.
Exactly. So let's break it down using some philosophical tools. So first, one of the major ethical frameworks we can use is utilitarianism. Excuse me. So people like Peter Singer, he's kind of the most famous person for this. His argument is kind of based around that hunting uh, is from the perspective of to maximize the welfare and minimize the pain of sentient beings. That's just the individual animal, though, and what Singer lacks is essentially what action produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So, with that perspective, supporters of delisting and hunting argue that grizzly bears are fully recovered in some areas and that regulating hunting could benefit both local economies, reduce human bear conflicts, and generate conservation funds through those license sales, consequently benefiting the grizzly population as a whole rather than just focusing on the individual animal.
On the other hand, opponents argue that the intricate value of grizzly bears, especially as intelligent sentient beings, should prevent us from using them as resources or trophies. That perspective, most famously that like that of Tom Reagan, leans more towards the rights-based or deontological view where animals have moral status regardless of their utility to humans.
So then you also have the environmental ethics angle. So grizzlies play a crucial role as apex predators and scavengers in the ecosystems they inhabit. Removing them or destabilizing their populations could have ripple effects on biodiversity and ecosystem balance.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the historical and cultural dimensions. Many indigenous groups have deep spiritual and cultural relationships with grizzlies. Some tribes view them as kin or sacred beings. So ethical management must also respect indigenous sovereignty and worldviews.
That's a crucial and key point. It's just not abstract philosophy. There are real world consequences. For instance, after the federal government removed protections in 2017, Wyoming and Idaho proposed limited trophy hunts, but public backlash and court rulings reversed those plans. The debate continues today.
And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So living in Wyoming and being from that, I saw that firsthand. When that ruling came out, Wyoming Fish and Game immediately had a great idea to remove or to add grizzly tags to their limited draw entries for a precious price that could draw in not only more hunters to the land, which would help the local economy, but could also help the local hunters and people living in that area like myself who don't like to go out in the woods anymore with less than three people because it's kind of dangerous. And another way that I look at that is there's a lot of guide services up towards like the Yellowstone area that ran like deep backcountry camps, and all these grizzly bears now they've become known essentially in our community as dinner bell bears. So they hear a gunshot and they just go right to it immediately because they know they're not going to get shot at because there's hunters that can't do anything about that. And going kind of along with that, my neighbor where I live, he's a retired fish and game agent that worked closely with Yellowstone National Park. And according to their numbers they had to meet the federal quota to take them off the endangered species list, they had that number in 2002. So that's kind of a crazy stat when you think about how many bears could come around from that.
Exactly, and that kind of goes back to that utilitarian approach, is that you have policymakers or voters who aren't living in these areas, and they're making feelings-based decisions, not reason-based decisions, and it's going to end up hurting the grizzly bear population in the end because, for one, they're going to get overpopulated. Pretty soon, they're going to become even more of a problem. As you said, with these ranchers, these guide services, where the state is going to have to make a decision to just eradicate them from certain areas because they're so strong in those areas.
So what are we left with? Is there a right answer? Not necessarily, but philosophy helps us ask better questions. Should humans prioritize safety and economic benefit, or ecological integrity and animal rights? Should we manage nature or coexist with it more humbly?
Those are just great questions. And like you said, maybe the answer lies somewhere in between. There's always a gray area in these things. But I think that's the importance of thinking about this ethically and from a reason-based approach. Because, it's obviously clear that grizzly bears challenge us to think critically about the shared space with these wild animals. And that ethical relationship that we want to have with them, it's not going to be the same as it was 100 years ago. Things have progressed, so we need to kind of progress our thinking along with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I'm from the mindset of that we should absolutely have grizzly bears because they keep other animal herds like elk and stuff. They keep their populations growing and limited because they fend off wolves and other apex predators because the bear is the king. So with that being said, I think of how grizzly bears and hunters like myself, and I know T-Love, everybody that I'm around loves hunting, hiking in the backcountry.
Absolutely.
And they don't want to be fearing around every corner knowing, oh, there could be a bear in the brush around here that I'm worried about, and I'm not really allowed to protect myself because I'm going to get in some serious trouble and get fined a lot of money if I shoot one of these bears protecting myself.
Absolutely. Well, that's about all we have. Any closing remarks?
No, not really. I mean, just to kind of going back on it, it's kind of there's not going to be a right or a wrong answer. One side is always going to think that they're right and the other's going to be wrong. And it's always going to be a pendulum swinging one way or another. But eventually it's going to come down to a point where people in their own minds out there are going to have to kind of do what they have to do in a way to protect what's theirs and sources.
Awesome. And I'll just end you. As a listener, I challenge you to do some research, think about this from a reason approach, not just merely feelings-based, and maybe we can compromise and find the right answer. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Grizzly Ethics.